If you don't know how to use aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, then it's impossible to get perfect landscape photography. Luckily for you, I can show you how to master these settings easily. What's up, y'all? It's Project Photography back with another video, and today, understanding how to use your camera settings to its fullest is a major advantage as a landscape photographer. Why, you may ask? Because understanding your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO allows you to get sharper images corner to corner, less noise in your photos overall, and gives you more creative control over your images. So we should start and talk about aperture. So let's talk about what an aperture is. And essentially, it's the iris in the camera lens that opens and closes to let light into your camera sensor. And with a faster f-stop like a 1.2 or 1.8, that is generally going to get you a shallower depth of field, which means that there's more background blur. By having a faster aperture, you're able to let more light into the frame, which is great for low light situations. But what happens if you stop down the aperture to something like an f8? This will allow you to increase the depth of field and get more of your elements in focus, but this will lead to less light that's being let inside of your sensor. And for landscape photography, we are 95% of the time going to be shooting at an aperture of around f8 to f11. And for me, this is especially nice because you're able to get really sharp images that are in the center as well as in the corners, and most of the time I just set it and forget about it. And because most lenses do not start at an aperture of f8, we're able to stop down to the aperture, which means that we're able to get better performance overall with majority of our lenses. But even though aperture is really important, it's not the only camera setting that will get you sharp images, which is where ISO will come in. And your camera's ISO will essentially dictate how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. And by having a lower ISO, you're able to have better dynamic range and get cleaner images overall, but that means that your camera is less sensitive to light. Whereas on the other side of the coin, if you have a higher ISO, your camera will not perform as well when it comes to dynamic range, introducing things like grain into the image, making your image overall less sharp. But it is great in low light situations in particular. And when it comes to landscape photography, we're going to want the best dynamic range possible, which is why we have to use the lowest base ISO. And this is especially nice because when we're shooting landscape photography, we're going to get very high contrast situations where the sky is pretty bright and the foreground is pretty dark, and this will allow us to get the best performance possible, especially when editing. This will help us retain better detail throughout the entire image and get cleaner images overall. But we can't talk about ISO without talking about shutter speed, because shutter speed is where it's going to get us the most creative control over our images. But with shutter speed, it essentially is how fast or slow your shutter is allowed to open or close. And with a faster shutter speed, you're able to open and close that shutter really fast, which allows us to freeze motion and makes our images less blurry overall. But with a faster shutter speed, we are getting less light that is coming into the sensor. And with a slower shutter speed, we're able to let more light into the frame, but this also results in more motion blur. But when it comes to landscape photography, we're going to want a faster shutter speed when we're photographing things that aren't really moving. Like for example, the mountains or trees. We want that faster shutter speed to be able to make sure we get it nice and sharp. But if we have other subjects that are moving towards us, like water or clouds, then we can use a lower shutter speed to be able to showcase that motion blur and get that movement in the frame. But this is also something I made an entire video on, so if you want to go and check it out, it is right there. But let me put you guys behind the camera so I can show you guys exactly how I'm photographing this scene. So for this scene right here, I already have my composition set up. But what we're going to go ahead and do is set our aperture to f8, drop down our ISO to 100, and then just adjust our shutter speed to make sure we have a nice and even exposure. Then all we're going to do is go ahead and set the release mode to self timer, so we make sure that our hand doesn't interfere when it comes to actually getting a sharp image. Then we can just go ahead and press the shutter and it'll take the image for us. And as you can see with the edited version, it is a very sharp image corner to corner. And because we shot at a base ISO of 100, we're able to get really clean shadows as well as less noise in the frame overall. It really is that easy to do, but I want to give you guys some pro tips that help me get better landscape images. First of all, we always have to use a tripod because even in low light situations, we still want to be shooting at an aperture of f8 and a base ISO of 100. And because we are using that slower aperture and a low ISO, this will mean that our shutter speed is going to be a lot slower. Because for me, I was shooting at 1/5 of a second, and that's really hard to get a handheld sharp image like that. So having a tripod is an absolute necessity, but generally speaking, this will just allow you to get more cleaner compositions overall as well. And another major pro tip is that when I'm actually changing my settings, I always make sure that I'm changing my aperture first, and then my ISO, and then my shutter speed. Because my aperture and my ISO will majority of the time stay the same, our shutter speed allows us to get the most creative control out of our images, because we're able to do things like blur out motion, for example, with water or the clouds moving. That is huge to showcase movement in your images and get more dynamic photos overall. So I hope this video was really helpful in explaining aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, because if you can master those three, that is huge and on your way to getting much sharper, cleaner landscape images. So thank you guys so much for experiencing the world with me today. And if you have any questions about aperture, shutter speed, or ISO, feel free to leave it in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.